When people say or do something that seems unreasonable to us, we might say to them, "What, are you crazy?" In the passage we are going to look at today, John chapter 8, verses 48 through 54, we are going to see the Jewish leaders call Jesus crazy for some of the things that he has said to them in previous verses. Jesus will deny the charge, of course, and tell the Jewish leaders he is simply telling them the truth, a truth that he received from God the Father, no matter how crazy it might seem to them. Every human being has to decide whether Jesus is a truth teller about who he is and what God has said to him, or whether he is simply insane or a liar. In verses 48 through 50, we will see the charge of the Jewish leaders and Jesus' denial of the charge. Jesus will then claim to be the giver of eternal life, and a further claim of craziness from the Jewish leaders in verses 51 through 54. So let's take a look at the passage. John chapter 8, verses 48 through 54. The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham who died, and the prophets who died? Who do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say, he is our God." Now in verses 48 through 50, we're going to see the Jewish leaders charge Jesus with craziness, with insanity, and we'll see Jesus' denial of that fact and his defense. In previous verses, Jesus has said two things that strike the Jewish leaders as absolutely nuts. He has called them children of the devil, and he has claimed to be without sin. Now, if you went downtown Steamboat today and you asked people who claimed to be told people who claimed to be unbelievers that they were children of the devil, they would probably call you nuts too. And if you knew someone who claimed that they were without sin, you would probably call them crazy. Why? Because nobody's perfect. We all admit this. Except Jesus, of course, if his claim is true. In verse 48, we will see the insult of the Jewish leaders. In verse 49, we will see Jesus' denial of the charge. And in verse 50, we will see Jesus state that he is content to let God judge between them. So let's take a look first at verse 48. The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" The Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans returned that hate with interest. The Samaritans, you see, were half Jewish and half Gentile, and they worshiped God in a way that the Jewish leaders would have just found abominable, horrible, heretical. In some ways, calling another Jew a Samaritan was worse than calling them a Gentile, because in the Jewish mind, the Samaritans were traitors to the God that they worshipped. But to say that someone had a demon was essentially to call them crazy, because demons often caused human beings to do and say things that were unreasonable and even self-harming. To call Jesus a Samaritan and demon-possessed was to call him a traitor to God and the Jewish people and crazy. And it is no wonder that they called him these things, because Jesus had said that everyone who didn't believe in Jesus was a child of the devil, and that he himself was sinless. Now, these are statements that could be considered crazy if Jesus were merely human. So how does Jesus respond to the insult? Well, we see the answer in verse 49. Let's take a look. Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me." Jesus says that his statements are not the result of being crazy, of having a demon. He is simply speaking the words that the Father has given him. And he honors the Father by speaking the truth that the Father has given him. And then he says, you dishonor me, and by implication, the Father, because you won't believe the words that the Father has given me. I'm telling you the truth. You won't believe the truth. Jesus is going to continue to obediently speak the Father's words no matter what it does to his own reputation, as we will see in verse 50. Take a look. Yet I do not seek, Jesus says, I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Jesus knows that speaking the words of God, the truth of God, in a world that is controlled by Satan, who hates God, hates his word, hates the salvation of unbelievers, he knows that speaking those words is going to cause the world to be hostile to him, but he doesn't care. Why? Because there is one who seeks Jesus' glory, God the Father. He is content to let the Father judge between him and his accusers, the Jewish leaders, because he knows that the Father will vindicate him when he gets back to heaven. Now, may I ask you a personal question? Have you ever refused to share the gospel with someone because you were afraid that they might reject you, might revile you, might even persecute you? Shouldn't we care more about what the Father thinks about us than what people think about us? Even if people reject us here on earth and revile us for telling the truth, even if they persecute us, we will be honored by the Father in heaven for being obedient to him, just as Jesus set the example for us. In verses 51 through 54, Jesus is going to make a statement that confirms to his enemies that he is absolutely nuts. And we will take a look at his amazing statement, the Jewish response, and his defense. In these verses 51 through 54, we will see Jesus utter another amazing statement, a statement that could not come out of the mouth of a mere human being unless he was a liar. We will see the Jewish leaders state that they are now absolutely convinced that Jesus is insane, and they will give their reasoning for their statement. And then finally, we will see Jesus' defense of his amazing statement. So let's look first at what Jesus says, this amazing statement that Jesus makes. Let's take a look at verse 51. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Truly, truly is a sure sign that Jesus is about to say something that we should remember, something that is underlined in what he says and comes straight from the heart of God the Father. Then he says, and there's a condition, he says, if anyone keeps my word. What does he mean by keep my word? It means that you hear what he says, you internalize it in belief, and you act on it. You believe it and obey. And then he makes a promise. If you do this, if you keep my word, he says, Jesus promises, he will never see death. Now, can you imagine any human being, any mere human beings, saying such a thing unless they were absolutely nuts or they were lying and trying to take advantage of you? Jesus is saying, obey me and you will never die. But wait, you might be thinking, he died, and all of his disciples died, and all of the believers over 2,000 years, except those still living, have died. Did Jesus lie to his followers? Certainly the Jewish leaders thought he was lying to everyone. No, Jesus was not lying. He was simply talking about another kind of death. He wasn't talking about physical death, the separation of the living from the dead. He was talking about another kind of death, a spiritual death, a separation of the person from the living God. Jesus is saying that those believers, those who believe him and obey him, will never be separated from God. Never. They will never see spiritual death. This is an amazing statement, and it threw the Jewish leaders into a tizzy, as you can see in verse 52. The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death." They had thought him crazy for calling them children of the devil and claiming to be sinless. But now with the statement that anyone who believes in him and obeys his word will never see death, they are absolutely sure that he is just out of his mind. Abraham and all the prophets have died, they say. How can you, the Jewish leaders say, a mere man, claim what the fathers would never have claimed for themselves? But you see, they have misunderstood what Jesus is claiming. Abraham and the prophets had all died physically, but they were still alive spiritually. They went into a holding place until the cross would forgive them of their sins. They went into a place that the Old Testament calls Abraham's bosom, and they waited there until Jesus died, and then they entered into the Father's presence for all eternity. They were spiritually alive, though physically dead. But the Jewish leaders were not just wrong about the kind of death that Jesus was talking about, they were also wrong about who he is and who he was. Let's take a look at verse 53. Are you greater than our father Abraham who died, and the prophets who died? And the answer is yes. Jesus is claiming to be greater than Abraham, Moses, and all the prophets. Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, God in the flesh. And then they make an amazing statement, the Jewish leaders. Who do you make yourself out to be? In essence, they are asking, who are you to make such a statement? And Jesus says, I am God in the flesh. I am a man, but I am more than just a man. And I can make these statements, and they are statements of fact. You can either reject them or you can accept them. But you see, the Jewish leaders don't want to believe what Jesus says, and so they think him to be crazy. So let's see how Jesus responds to their incredulous questions in verse 54. Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. Jesus says he is not trying to glorify himself. He is simply telling them the truth that God the Father has given him to tell them. The person that they call their God is the one who will glorify him in their presence in heaven. Jesus has indeed made statements that would be crazy coming out of the mouth of a mere human being. He has claimed that all unbelievers are children of the devil, that he is without sin, and that all who believe in him will never die spiritually. If Jesus is a mere man, then you could reasonably assert that he is insane. But Jesus is not a mere man. Certainly, that was the conclusion that the Jewish leaders came to, that he was merely a man and that he was crazy, or that he was lying and trying to take advantage of the people. But if you believe that Jesus is who he says he is, the Son of God, God in the flesh, then his statements are simply the truth, statements of fact. Now, how do we apply these verses? Number one, we should tell people about the gospel even if they reject us, because God will honor us when we get to heaven. Two, if you were a believer, if you've put your faith in Jesus Christ and you obey what Jesus says, you can count on Jesus' promise that you will never be separated from God by spiritual death. And three, it is always good to ask non-Christians who they think Jesus is, and then confront them with the truth about what Jesus said about himself. The great Christian philosopher and writer C.S. Lewis has written this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on the level of a man who calls himself a poached egg, or else he'd be a devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit on him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to.